All right, welcome to this edition of Inside Aviation. I'm Ryan,
I'm Kevin.
and we have an exciting guest today. Some of you all might already know Marc Cook, editor-in-chief of KITPLANES. Really cool insights into the home build world. I learned a lot from Marc about kind of getting the home build world into the next generation and all the stuff around vans and some really interesting topics. What did you learn from that, Kevin?
I think I kind of learned more of like how the industry has, well, that part of the industry has evolved, because I've always thought experimental aircraft were kind of sketchy growing up around them. Until recent years, I've really got my hands around it and actually flown in them, and I can see the appeal of actually building one, but the performance of them is comparable to some of the more expensive GA aircraft, more expensive certified aircraft, which is awesome. But I actually chatted with him a bit afterwards after our call, and I didn't know he built 2 aircraft himself, which is, maybe we can get him on to talk about that, but that sounds very frustrating. I'm sure for the right person, it's really fun.
Well, but, and I'm just totally naive, to this subject. I mean, I know some about it, obviously, but not a whole lot. And I just was surprised of how much quality can go into some of these home built airplanes, and the time it takes. I mean, I think Marc makes a great point that the money's one thing, but having the time to do it is another. And it was just really interesting. Just a very different world.
Yeah, they're incredible. I like the ones I've been in have better panels and better interiors than some of most of the certified stuff I've been in. So that's awesome. But yeah, we'll get to that with Marc. Ryan, so why are we here again? Why are we here talking about the 787?
Oh man, I feel like
what's going on?
I feel like every episode that we do here, we're always bringing up something with Boeing. But more 787 inspections, more scrutiny from the FAA. Boeing says that some of the claims that have been made about quality assurance are not a safety of flight issue. Some records were apparently falsified internally. But again, Boeing says that it's not a safety of flight issue, but certainly the FAA will look into it. Knock on wood, I don't expect this to be an issue where the whole 787 fleet is grounded. That already happened once several years ago. But definitely kind of interesting. Another saga in Boeing's ongoing storyline here, and just kind of keeps me busy.
Yeah. Was this started because of the whistleblower or the congressional hearing, or what kind of forced the FAA to do that?
I think it was part of it, certainly. But I think this is sort of different in that now the issue is that there were some records falsified internally, which is never as good when you're manufacturing airplanes, obviously.
Yeah. It's not great. So I have a question real quick. Hold on. Before we get to the next topic. So I was on TikTok and I was going through, there was a 787 wing. I think it was a country, it was in the US airline, but it had speed tape all over the wing. And also there was like a hole in one section. Do you know where that's from?
Yeah, I've seen it.
How, like what?
I mean, have you ever held speed tape before?
No, I understand that, but like the hole,
yeah.
You're cool. Like that's an airworthy wing. What?
I mean,
what's going on there?
I can't speak for other countries, but certainly in the U.S., Part 121 carriers maintenance programs are fairly in depth, and inspections like that are done very often.
It was just insane.
I don't know.
I know speed tape works. Like speed tape is cool, but like, is that a problem with the degradation of the composite material for the wing there for the 787?
Well, they do call it the plastic princess.
Cool, love that.
But yeah, or there's another name for it that I don't think I can say here. But I just it's not good in optics at the end of the day, right? Also, you have people looking out at that big wing from the cabin, those big windows, and they see a hole in it, and along with some tape. It doesn't really look too good for the layman. So definitely kind of interesting in a way but also remember the cost too. Like if it's still an airworthy airplane, and maintenance personnel and the manufacturer for that matter can say, okay, well, this is probably not a huge deal. A low-cost airline that's operating these things might not want to put forth the money to do that repair at this moment. especially if it's more of a cosmetic repair.
There's a hole in it. Yeah, and I don't think that was cosmetic, but yeah, I feel you. I know it doesn't happen on U.S. airlines often, but
We need to talk about your story on flyingmag.com that you flew all the way somewhere to get pizza.
yeah. So me and my girlfriend Alex flew to Colorado Plains Regional Airport in Akron,
I
Colorado.
think Akron's in
Uh,
Ohio.
I don't know. Dude, they have the weirdest names for towns here in Colorado. They like totally mispronounce them, but it was awesome. It was like almost near Kansas. I've heard of this little pizza place on the airfield, and I wanted to go try it because we've been kind of not to bag on diners here at airports, but we've gone kind of over them. So we're like, let's try a pizza place at an airport. And it was really cool. It's called Misbehavin'. It's the name's based on the FBO owner's dad's plane that he flew in World War II. You can read all the history there in the article and then their website. Pizza was awesome. Incredible place to go fly to. I mean, there was like Embraer 100 that stopped there just for the pizza as we were leaving, which I think is pretty cool. I also learned that like a lot of people who get picked up in Colorado, so like in Centennial or Rocky Mountain Metro via charter, they'll ask the charter to stop for pizza first before they pick them up, which is a little thing I didn't put in the story, but I thought it was pretty interesting. Go check that out on Flying Mag. But see, I didn't have to look at a hole in a wing, and I got pizza.
There you go. You just kind of got uprooted a little bit when you were pulled in there with your Cessna and a Phenom pulled up right next to you.
Hey, what are you gonna do? Can't really do much after that. Ask for a ride? I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, we'll go over cool airplanes with no holes in the wings here with Marc Cook and dive a little bit into the whole Vans aircraft saga.
All right, let's do it. All right, we're here with Marc Cook from KITPLANES. Marc, tell us about what you do and how you got into it.
Oh God, what don't I do? Well, as editor-in-chief of KITPLANES magazine, it really is it's a joy to create a product for guys who want to build their own airplanes, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a little bit more depth, I'm sure, in our conversation. But really, it's a category of airplanes that you have a lot of flexibility and freedom to configure the way you want, and really have a lot of fun putting them together. It's a real educational experience. In fact, that's kind of one of the parts of the rule, the way we get away with building our own planes and licensing them as the manufacturer is for education and recreation. And having built a few airplanes, I can tell you that's a big part of it.
I gotcha. So tell us a little bit about what KITPLANES is, what the publication covers. I know it's print and digital, but why don't you tell the audience a little more about it?
Sure. We are print and digital, as you say. In fact, we're going into our 40th year in publication. And really, that kind of tracks the big part of experimental aviation in terms of its popularity. Now, it goes way back. The original rules were made in 1947. The Experimental Aircraft Association that we know of, which supports home-built aircraft, as we call them, was founded in 1953. So it's been going on for quite a while. But really, the home-built market took off in the 70s and 80s when you started to get what we call kit airplanes. Prior to that, if you wanted to build your own airplane, you had to find all the parts. You had to get plans for something. You had to go scrounge the metal tubing. You probably found an engine that was sitting at the back of somebody's hangar, and you taught yourself or you learned how to rebuild that engine. And a lot of those early builders were doing it primarily for money reasons. They would trade their labor for the cost of the finished part, if you will. And remember, too, this is a period when a lot of people grew up on farms, so it wasn't unusual for part of your own education to be learning how to weld, learning how to work with your hands, learning all mechanical things, because if you didn't, the tractor didn't run or the pump didn't work and you guys didn't have a crop. So that was a big part of home building. And then, of course, the kits came along, which really bundled a lot of the components into pieces that you would assemble on your own. So for KITPLANES, we've seen the latter half of that. Obviously, having been in business since 1984, we missed the first part of that. We call the pioneer period, if you will. But the advent of these kits that provided almost all of the parts you needed for the airframe part of the kit anyway, really spurred a big growth in the industry. And we had a lot of innovation. Burt Rutan started building his airplanes, and we saw the Very Easy and the Long Easy and all these Canard-style airplanes, which people on the outside look at and go, well, they're really funny-looking airplanes. You know, the tail is in the front, and it doesn't have a conventional tail, and the engine faces the wrong way. But truthfully, the most interesting thing about those airplanes to me was the way they were built. They introduced a moldless fiberglass composite idea that allowed you to basically reproduce this in your basement or your garage much more easily than building a lot of these earlier airplanes from scratch. And they really revolutionized a lot of parts of the kit industry. So for KITPLANES, we look at that and we help to support people who are building airplanes new today. But I think equally importantly, we talk to builders and owners who are still completing some airplanes. I mean, truthfully, there's some kit airplanes that were started 20 years ago that aren't finished. It does take some time, and, life gets in the way. But we're also seeing a significant influx of people who are buying somebody else's home builds. And this is becoming, I think, more common now as a big bulk of the late 80s, early 90s airplanes who were built by older individuals at the time really ended up going on to, they aged out, were passed on, and these airplanes came out into the ecosystem. So we've got people who are purchasing those airplanes and having to learn how to work with them at that point. So it's really a very broad category. We don't just have one customer who's building a brand new airplane. We've got a whole bunch of people who are everywhere on the spectrum, from finishing up their very basic airplane to deciding which of the very advanced airplanes they want to build today.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think lately it's become more and more mainstream. And I don't know if that's because of certain brands out there like Vans. But do you think that whole category of aircraft is actually bleeding into general aviation? So like some of the tech that starts in KITPLANES or some of the, designs eventually make their way, if not, the exact one, some of it makes it to the other general aviation brands or even higher.
Definitely. We've had a lot of the tech that had started in experimental aviation eventually migrate into general aviation. And there's a few categories of that. Believe it or not, we see a lot of that in the avionics side. You could argue that the flat screen EFISs that are, dominant today really started in the experimental world. And the reason
not G3X Touch, right? That started.
Well, there were many before that. Yeah, You're right. G3X Touch was first released in experimental. In fact, I was one of the early users of the pre-Touch G3X that Garmin brought out as a follow-on to the 696 GPS, and that was a very popular unit in experimentals. And a lot of the benefit, obviously, is that as an experimental aircraft, I, as the builder, can decide what I put in it. I don't need to have it part of the type certificate. I don't have to have TSO'd equipment for the most part. And so the flexibility for the builder allows these companies to say, hey, we want to try this out. We want to produce some new technology that maybe we're not sure is going to sell well enough to go into the effort of certifying it or going to the time that it takes to certify this stuff, which is not to say that the products aren't certifiable. There's a big difference between having a really great product that really works well and actually having the certification or the TSO at the end of the process. It's a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of paperwork. So some of these companies just said, listen, we can sell enough into the experimental market, give these guys some really cool technology, and in a sense, let them beta test for us, although that's a little unfair because most of that stuff was really, really good. But what they did allow was you have this distributed pool of pilots and owners who can try on this technology. And when you have something new to test out in the world, you can release it and say, hey guys, we have a new feature for you. Try it out. See how this works for you. And that's something that you could do in the certified world. It just takes a whole lot longer and a whole lot more money to do.
Yeah, no, it does. I sometimes look at, experimental aircraft. They have incredible panels, incredible interiors. So going back to when I was a kid and I would go to fly-ins or air shows and I would see experimental aircraft, I was like, who would be flying in an experimental aircraft? Do you think the that sentiment across the industry of like being kind of sketchy, for lack of a better word, not that they ever were, but just that perception. Do you think that's improved in like the last couple decades? Because to me personally, it feels like it has.
Definitely. And some of the early ones were kind of sketchy. And we occasionally see some designs that maybe don't have the most engineering behind them. Those are really, really, really few and far between these days. I would say it's a very mature industry from that standpoint. And I think the prevalence of some very popular designs, the vans, RVs are obviously a great example. There's more than 11,000 of those flying among a fleet of 55 to 60,000 home builds total. So, we're still a teeny tiny part of the market, but vans is really a dominant manufacturer or design in our world. And I think the prevalence of the RVs, the acceptance at most airports of having a home built airplane is very different than it was 20 or 30 years ago. There really were, the Bonanza guys and the Cessna guys would look down their noses like, yeah, you're going to fly that, lawn chair with wings. And, they would kind of huff and puff about it. Ironically, many of those guys, they got their, they turned 65 and got their first insurance bill on their Bonanza and went, hey, that RV looks pretty good. So that's part of it. I think just being on the ground, being there, understanding that we're not all, crazy, wild-eyed fanatics who just want to have something to be different. We actually want better airplanes. On top of the fact that the mature designs have real engineering behind it. And if I can get anything across today, that would be it. That the popular airplanes, the vans aircraft in particular, have a lot of engineering behind them. Are they certified? No. Are they in a world where it wouldn't take millions of dollars to certify an airplane? Are they certifiable? Yeah, definitely they are. And in fact, I think you could say the RV series has been successful to a great extent because they're really conventional airplanes. There's no secret sauce in there. They're conventional aluminum airplanes. They use the same material and construction techniques as a Cessna. They're smaller, they have more horsepower, so they're faster. Well, duh. I mean, there's really no magic in that, but they balance the performance in a way that is much more exciting than a Cessna or a Cherokee would be. And the fact that there's engineering behind them makes them pretty safe if you fly them with some intelligence.
Yeah, no, and they have like a ton of data now, right? Because of thousands and thousands of hours of flight time. I think, visually the vans doesn't look like an experimental aircraft, like most of them. And I've heard stories of people even, choosing an RV-10 instead of a 182 or a Cirrus. Like now it's like a viable option. What other manufacturers, because vans is like a pretty dominant one. What other manufacturers are out there that are building kits that are starting to gain more popularity and just like breaking more into that mainstream?
I think we have, like I said earlier, it's a really mature industry. So you have a handful of leaders in there. And I think in terms of Zenith Aircraft, Rand's Aircraft, Randy Schlitter, the designer there, is really prolific and really interesting. I'll come back to your list, but as an aside, if you look at what Randy has done in the past, some of his were really wild designs. And it was clearly Randy, really a smart guy, terrific guy, working out some of these. What can we do that's different? What can we do that is against the mainstream? And today, his most successful airplanes are kind of the most conventional. But the trick is they're really well built, they're really well designed, and they're really easy to build. He's developed the kit part of it really quite well. You have aircraft like the Kit Fox. Now, again, Kit Fox and Zenith, ironically, both are having their 40th anniversaries this year. So you've got companies who've been in it for the long run. And I think successful because they provide really good kits. They provide really good support. And I don't know if we'll get back to this, but I think support from the builder standpoint is more important now than it ever has been because of the nature of the builders and what they expect from the companies. And so you have those are kind of the top 4 or 5. I'm sure I'm missing a few and I'm going to get some emails and whatnot, but it really is sort of a traditional set. It's hard to break into it. One of the companies that is breaking in, and I don't want to forget these guys, is Sling Aircraft. It's a South African company. they have some real benefits in their home country economies. They do an awful lot of work to build very complete airplanes that come here and don't need a ton of work to them. But what's interesting about them, they're very clever airplanes, but they're also really conventional. They're all, mostly metal airplanes. They use pole rivets instead of driven rivets, so they're easier to build. They're not doing the weird things that the Rutans of the world were doing in the 70s, or even really stretching the performance boundaries so much as we saw with Burt Rutan, or even later than that, the Lancer and Glasair wars, as we call them, as they kept throwing bigger and bigger engines into smaller and smaller airframes. So it's a very mature. It's a mature industry from the design standpoint, with a lot of the focus just being on making better kits.
Yeah, no, I think Sling is a really good example of, like, some people don't even know they're kit aircraft, and they're incredible. I know they did a deal similar to Vans did with a YouTuber, with JP, and that was kind of my first look into how that kit's put together, its performance. It was really cool. It's awesome. So is all their manufacturing and their support, is that still in South Africa, or is it have they moved anything over here to the States? I know they have something in California, right?
They do. They have a pretty good sized facility at the Torrance Airport in California. And you mentioned the social stuff. I think it's really interesting. I know those guys fairly well, and they sort of have a built-in breeding pool of social influencers over there because of the Sling Flight Academy. So they've got these, I'm going to say youngsters, clearly I'm not the gray hair, but these younger pilots and people who love to do this stuff. So if you look at their social footprint, it's really very impressive, and it's all kind of volunteer. But yeah, they do have support here. They're still building that up, and I think they would admit that to get to the next level, they're probably going to have to build that up even more. They'll probably have to have some more representation across the country. It's a problem with some of these kit manufacturers. They are where they are, whether you're in Idaho or Oregon or Texas, and the opportunity to have service centers or to have support outside your immediate area is a bit challenging. And I think that's one of the places we'll probably go. But Sling is aware of that. They have a real incremental approach to what they're doing. The high wing airplane, which is their newest design, has been doing fairly well for them. There's a couple of those going together with the new Rotax 916 in it, which will give it another 19 horsepower, which will help. We're supposed to get to fly one of those pretty soon. Should be a lot of fun. So they're innovating in that way. And I have to give them a bit of a shout out, and this is not strictly from the experimental side, but they've recently taken on some noise issues at their home airport in Torrance because they were starting to get some complaints about all the flight training they were doing there. And they're doing a lot of flight training, more than any other facility on the field. And although they use the Sling, which has a 912 in it, it's not a very loud airplane. It has good performance, so it gets up and out of the pattern pretty quickly. They're still trying to be proactive about it. So they actually introduced something called a whisper sling, which is a very quieted airplane, has a different prop, different exhaust. And they put a significant amount of effort trying to get the noise out of the airplane and to be a better neighbor that way. I mean, they kind of had to do it, but they, by the FAA rules, they didn't have to, but as being a good citizen and a good neighbor there in Torrance, they took it on themselves to do it. So, is the nature of the technology change we're seeing in Homebuilt more like that than it was, hey, let's have a new wing, or let's put the wing in a different place? As again, I keep using the term mature, but as the industry is mature, where do we find the benefits? Where do we find the real changes going forward? And that's going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I didn't know that about their whisper sling. Sorry, Ryan.
No, you're good.
That type of technology would go like perfectly into other OEMs, because I mean, that's just an issue at every GA airport now is noise complaints and, the community coming up against it. So I'll have to check that out after this, but that's awesome.
Right, exactly. And you guys just did a thing on fuels too. That's another part of this whole thing. So it's all an ecosystem. I tend to think of the Homebuilt stuff as sort of being off on its own little oasis, but yeah, we have to swim in the big river. We have to use everybody's fuel. We have to work with the supply chain stuff. All of that stuff impacts us. We have a lot of flexibility in the things we do and some additional choices that you wouldn't have on either the SLSA or the Mosaic or the certified side. But we're still tied into that ecosystem.
Mark, a bit of a layman's question here. Just kind of curious though, in terms of home built aircraft, what's the spectrum that you see? You know, there's certainly stuff you can go on YouTube and find videos of guys who strap an industrial fan to their back with a parachute. Would you consider that a home built airplane?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, we have the entire category that tends to get forgotten in terms of ultralights. So, you know, these are aircraft that you can buy fully assembled. They have to be, you know, a certain weight, 254 pounds. They can only go 55 knots or miles an hour. I think it's knots. Can only carry 5 gallons of fuel. So they're very limited, but those require no pilot's license whatsoever. We, you know, that at my home airport, we have a few of those buzzing around when the weather is nice. But we do really have a broad spectrum of aircraft that fall into that. And it really depends on what you want them to do. The truth is the center of gravity in our world is kind of around the RB series, the 2-seat RB series. They're the most numerous. It's the most common customer is someone who's looking for an airplane that will replace or augment a certified airplane. A lot of our guys are just tired of supporting a 1960s vintage Cessna or Piper or Beech, and they want something that they can maintain themselves, that is much less expensive to maintain. Depending on the airplane, the insurance is actually pretty reasonable. So, you know, that's sort of the center of gravity of our world, but it does have a pretty broad spectrum. And with the coming of light sport aircraft 20 some years ago, and now as we're looking ahead to Mosaic, there's a little bit more emphasis on I'm going to say low end of the market. I don't mean anything by that except, let's say, lighter airplanes. I think we're going to see some innovation come there when Mosaic finally comes through, you know, sometime late next year, or maybe even as late as early 2026, that will eventually spill back into the experimental market and has some opportunities to make super quick build kits and a few other things. We don't know the full how the rules are going to be finally delivered. There's a lot of detail that's still kind of in the FAA's hands at this point, so it's a lot of wait and see. But it is an interesting spectrum. I think you do see the low end. Again, I hate to say, I don't mean anything by that. It's just it's an easier way to say lighter airplane, right? No offense, guys, really. But you know, that's still really relevant because a lot of people just want a simple airplane they can go have fun with, and it's the equivalent of a motorcycle or a jet ski for a lot of these people.
So you made an interesting point earlier when I was listening there to you and Kevin talk about kind of how this whole home built world kind of came to be, which is people on farms, and I'm kind of curious, you know, where do you see the market kind of going in terms of audience and people and adopters of these? Because I mean, I hate to say it, and there's no data to back my claim here, but I'm just going to say it. Us Gen Zers, you know, we're not really good with our hands. You know, so I'm just curious kind of where you see this going. Like, do you see a younger generation moving in here with Mosaic maybe?
For
Absolutely.
the record, I'm not Gen Z. I'm a millennial, so let me just separate
I'm not a
myself from
boomer
that.
either, all right?
Yeah.
None of this okay boomer crap. I'm not a boomer, technically.
I don't even know what I am, so.
All right, I'm in between. That's a good question. I think what we're going to see is a variety of things, and this is something KITPLANES we look at all the time in our content, not just what it is, but how we deliver it. And the truth is, most builders want some kind of support. They don't want to feel like they're doing the big dangerous parts on their own. And the truth is, it's been 30 or more years since the majority of the airplanes haven't had key critical structure done at the factory. In today's airplanes, the quick build opportunities, we call quick build kits, is a generic term for parts of the airplane that are constructed by the factory. By and large, those are all really critical items. Wing spar, primary structure in the cabin, things like welding the engine mount, all of that stuff. And so as the industry has matured, and it's been doing this for a while, the the nature of the build is more an assembly process than it is building things from scratch. And so if you're capable of reading directions, and sometimes I'm not either, it's really not that difficult to follow. But I will say the change in kit componentry and the quality of the kits has helped tremendously. I'll give you a quick example. Early on, some of the very first metal airplanes that you would call jigless, right? You didn't have to build a jig to put all the pieces together when you built the airplane. Something called matched hole tooling. So you basically had, imagine 2 pieces of aluminum that had holes already drilled in them. When you put them together with a cleco, holds the 2 sheets together, if you put them all in the right place, it automatically aligns that structure. So it does it for you. And you have a way to go, okay, there is no way this fits the wrong way. It can only fit the right way. And early versions of that, they had very small holes, and it was your job to drill them out, dress them, take the clecos out. I mean, you wore yourself out, putting a cleco in, then drilling the hole, and cleaning it up, then putting the rivet in, then checking it in. And nowadays, it's very common to have what they call final size hole. So the hole that's in the sheet is the size of the rivet that you're going to put through it. And in many cases, you assemble it, make sure all the parts are together. In the case of a Zenith, this is crazy. You can build a rudder in an easy weekend, less than a weekend. You can go to their factory. They give you the rudder to put together. It's all self-jigging. You use your cleco pliers to put it together. You pull rivets, so you don't have to have access to the back side of it. The new RV-15 from Vans is going to break tradition and be a pull rivet airplane. And I'll tell you, I've built airplanes where you got to get your hand behind it for a bucking bar to do all that stuff. And to be able to do it from the outside surface of the airplane is a game changer for a lot of these. So there's a long answer to your question, but the maturity of the kits change so that the building process is much simpler, much more resistant. I'm not going to say resistant to errors, but much less likely that the builder is going to make a huge, stupid error. We're always going to drop a tool and dent something. We're going to put the wrong size rivet somewhere. We're going to do minor things all the time. It's part of building the airplane. If you don't have one of those in your airplane, you weren't trying hard enough. But the fact is, all the real important stuff is done in a way that you really can't fail. And then there's really a third layer, and that is there's a lot of support structure around it. There's external classes you can take. If you go to AirVenture at Oshkosh, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of classes you can watch and see how people do welding. Okay, maybe you don't want to learn how to weld, but by watching somebody do it, understanding what you're looking at, you can grab the part that was provided to you and go, yeah, it's a good weld. Or no, that's not a good weld. I'm going to send it back to the factory. And they have that for fabric, for fiberglass, for metal, for hoses, for controls, anything that's in the airplane, they have a class for. So the educational aspect is out there and widely available. And then there's builder assist programs. Some companies have built-in builder assist programs that allow you to come in and work with factory personnel, work with factory tools and jigs, which is a real advantage, and to move a big part of the project along really quickly and with a real high level of quality, because you're working beside people who know what they're doing. They've built dozens of these things. They can almost predict when you're going to make the mistake, right? They've got an over-under on their chalkboard on the side. It's like, okay, he gets to rivet 65, and that's the one he's going to turn over, okay? So all of that combines to make today's home builds a lot easier to build, sort of from an emotional standpoint, if you will.
I think, Ryan, you also got to think of it like the barrier of entry for KITPLANES or for experimental is a little bit lower, but at the same time, it's higher on the actual labor side of it.
Oh yeah.
I think, just for anecdotally, I've seen, friends buy a kit, flying clubs start from, building kits. So we'll see more and more on that as it develops. And as, it's a 172 new is like $500,000. That's crazy.
I would say, if I'm going to add to that, if you don't mind, it's not just the labor and it's not just the money, it's the commitment. And that's where we see people go into these with really well-intentioned. I would say a high percentage of those who have a certain family situation, they have an income, they have one kid, maybe, they have a situation where you go, you know what? I really have always wanted to do this. So I got an extra bay in the garage. I can start working on this. And then life gets in the way, right? And so we see some of these projects slow down or stop. I've got a good friend of mine who's spent, 15 years building his airplane. He's okay with it because he's slotted it in the time that's available to him. But there is no question, and I don't want to sugarcoat this, that it's a big commitment. It's a big project. Even the most quick build, the most complete airplanes, there's a lot of parts in them, and there's a lot of commitment to your time, to your mindset, and most of all, a commitment to doing everything right. This is no play. You got to whole ass this job. There's no half-assing these jobs. So some people can't muster that for the entirety of the project, and that's where we see people drop out. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's interest, but inevitably, if it's a popular design, it'll go off to somebody else and somebody will finish it. A very high percentage of these airplanes that don't get finished by the original builder do get finished by somebody.
What do you think? What's the average time it takes to build an average size kit plane? What do you guys typically see?
It really, that's a really tough question because it depends on the kit you're starting with. Most kits, you'll see some kits that say, okay, finish it in 500 hours. It's a pretty well-known thing in our world that those numbers are pretty well made up, that you could probably make it if all you did was work on the airplane and you had no downtime. In other words, you didn't have to think about where the tool was. You didn't have to wait for supplies to come in. If you had every piece in front of you and every tool you needed and you knew how to use every one of those tools and you worked from end to end, a 500-hour airplane could be completed in 500 hours. It won't be painted. It won't have an interior. It won't have much in the way of wiring or radios. And it will just at that point be ready to fire up and taxi around. You're not done, not even close. So, the range is anywhere from a couple of thousand hours to 4,000 or 5,000 hours. And a lot of that is in the control of the builder. And this is something we recommend to a lot of people who asked us, how do we get started and what do we need to think about? The simple truth is that the closer you make your airplane to the way the factory did it, the faster it'll go and the easier it will go. Where most guys get cross-threaded is when they say, well, I want to do this different. I want a different engine. I want a different interior. I want a much bigger interior. God help us. I want to move the wing. I think the tail isn't big enough. Okay, you're everything you know about this airplane, you've just almost thrown out the window. So the more you stick to the plans, the more like that airplane, the more that airplane will be like other airplanes in the category and class, the more it'll be like the factory airplane, which has the benefit of engineering and flight testing and lots of modifications. I can tell you most of these companies, when they design an airplane, the airplane that comes in the kit eventually is sometimes very different from the one they started with. They may move the wing. They may change the tail. They may move the engine. They may completely change some parts of the structure. And if you back away from that, you lose all of that engineering. So it's really important that you build it the way the company intended it to be built. And, unless you have an aerodynamics degree or an engineering degree in structures, you're probably not smarter than the people who built it the first time.
Yeah, definitely not me. So Mark, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you, what's going on with Van's aircraft and how did they get into this situation they're currently in?
Well, it's a tough situation, and I really detest the term perfect storm, but it kind of applies here. If you go back into the pre-pandemic period, Vans had been tracking significant growth over that period. And I think it was a result of a few things. The RB-14 was their newer airplane. It was doing really well, very successful airplane. The RB-10, you mentioned earlier, is a fantastic airplane. A lot of people recognized it for the utility it has, speed, a lot of things that the certified airplanes just, they don't have in that kind of quantity. So Vans have been pushing really hard with those kits. They'd had a lot of orders on the books, and then the pandemic came. And I have a few pet theories on it, but I think the core one is that people had started projects or really wanted to do it, and they looked at COVID as an existential threat. And if I don't do this now, this damn thing, whatever it is going to kill me before I can do it. So across the industry, I mean, from ultralights up to the jets, we saw a spike in demand, huge spike. I mean, not just a little blip, but a really, really big one. And Vans has always had the ethos that they wanted to be an affordable airplane, and they wanted to fulfill the promise to the builder, to the customer, which was, you buy a kit from us, we're going to give you the kit. And we want to do that as quickly as possible. We want to do that as efficiently as possible. And that's baked in. That's Dick Van Grunsven right there. Even though he had left the day-to-day running of the company, that runs through the veins of the guys who work there. So they found themselves in the situation where they had all this demand, and they felt like they had to do almost anything to catch up with the demand. And that then ran into supply chain issues. It ran into this freight train of all the other economic things that they found themselves really pushing too hard to chase those sales. And then they discovered that the size of the company that it would become really overran their ability to kind of keep track of things internally. They had internal business systems in place that were fine for a certain size company that they'd just outgrown. And if you talk to anybody in business, they can tell you that there's a tipping point for some of those where it's completely unsustainable and turns into mayhem. So they kind of ran into this all at once, and then found themselves having to make good on some early quick build issues. They found themselves having to do some engineering work with their laser cut parts. And all of these things sort of came together where they said, we don't have enough coming in. We got a lot of these, we have a lot of these things that we have to fulfill for our customers, on top of the cost of the raw materials went through the roof. I mean, shipping went through the roof, raw materials went through the roof. All of this stuff that they couldn't control also impacted them. So they really got stuck by their own success, I think. So the good news with that is, they went through the process of filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. We got about another week or so before the court is expected to rule on the submitted program they put together as a reorganization. In that reorganization, I forget the exact number, most of the people who have an unsecured claim or unsecured creditors with the company will get 55% or so back. There's an early stipend that they'll get back right away, and then they'll get that back over time. But I think it's important to understand that what Vans had to do was raise prices on the kits, even if you had only purchased part of the kit. So some builders, for a number of builders, were faced with, all right, I budgeted $50,000 for the kit, but it's now going to be, 30% more, and I've got to figure out a way to do that. They had an opportunity to decline that and become part of the unsecured creditor pool, or to accept the new prices and go ahead with a purchase order. Something like 80% of the builders said, okay, we'll continue. That's a big number. And so that means that pool of unsecured creditors is relatively small compared to the entire pool. So that's generally good news. Have they taken it on the chin for having to raise prices? Yeah, you bet. Should they probably have been raising prices more aggressively before that? Probably. Hindsight is 20/20, right? So it's really easy for me to sit here and say this is what they should have done. I really do think they were very well-meaning in what they were trying to do, but events overtook them. So we'll know more in a week or so, mid-May, when we'll see what the court says about that. They've been working really hard to catch up with replacing parts that were made in the laser cut process to builders. They put a lot of effort into producing those replacement parts. They're providing them to builders free of charge. They're unspooling themselves from some other issues with outside suppliers. And unfortunately for them, there's a lot of places in the company that needed help, and it takes time. But I think they're working on it really diligently, and there's a lot of processes they're putting in place to prevent it from happening again. That's what I see. I just want to make sure it's like, if you survive it, make sure that you guys have all the Jersey barriers in place so you don't run off the road again. And what I understand is all of those things are being put in place. So that's another expense, but there you go.
Yeah. So going back real quick to the laser cut part parts. What happened there? What was that problem?
That was an effort to increase their capacity. So a lot of the van's parts up to that point, we talked about the parts that all intersect that have the pre-cut holes. Those are done on a punch press, and so those are done. Pieces of sheet aluminum are put in. It runs through a thing. It cuts the edges of the sheet aluminum. It punches the holes in it, and off it goes. As they were ramping up, they realized that was one of the pinch points in their manufacturing. So they said, "How can we do this? How do other people do this?" And laser cutting aluminum has been done a lot. It's definitely an alternative to having the punch press because so they needed to build that capacity in. So what really happened to them, I believe, is they defined what they call a tool path for the laser. So the laser isn't the size of the hole it's cutting; it's actually much smaller. And the original tool path had it designed sort of as a pretzel, so that the laser never lingered over a certain spot on the metal for any length of time. The supplier changed that tool path for whatever reason and ended up creating a little defect at the edge. Basically, it came in, did a 360, and stopped at the bottom. And so that defect is where they found some cracking to develop once the metal was worked. So that was a supplier issue primarily. Their QC department probably let them down a little bit on catching some of that stuff. But I will say they've kind of got they've got a little bit of a bad rap in the sense that I was there for a tech briefing, and one of the guys handed me 2 pieces of aluminum. He says, "Okay, which one of these is a laser cut part?" And I could tell one was kind of rough, and I said, "No, that's probably it." And he handed me the other one. Well, "Oh no, that's a punch part." He goes, "No, they're both laser cut." I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting." So there was a big variation from the best to worst. And then subsequently, they've done a lot of engineering work that says that even if you try to break the part, it's virtually impossible that whatever little fissure you find is actually going to be the source of any cracking. And they showed us all the work they did with fixtures and third-party engineering testers. And there were a bunch of us in the room who looked at each other and said, "If I had one of these airplanes that had some laser cut parts in it, would I replace them?" And we said, "Probably not." Would I keep an eye on them? Yeah, of course, because we know that there's a non-zero chance of something going on. But would I pull my airplane apart to change it? No, not a bit. So that's where we are with that.
Yeah, I was there in 2019, late 2019, picking up an RV-12, and I love everybody there. They're great. Going to the actual facility was like you get a feel for like what they're about and like how much history is in that. And no, but they had just rolled out those machines at that point, and I think they were like showing them to us. So that's pretty interesting that happened.
Yeah. And they have, by the way, since then, I'll let you get to that in a second. Since then, they've actually added a lot more capability. That was part of the sort of the early investment that Dig Van Brunsven helped support to get them another one of those punch presses. And, the RV-15 is going to be a bigger airplane, so it's going to need a bigger punch press anyway. So they put that in, and they've actually got that up and running along with some additional CNC capability. So, while this is happening, they're not just all standing around going, "God, what do we do, guys?" They've been pushing ahead with, looking to the future on this stuff and saying, "We will get through this. So what's this business and this company going to look like when we do?" And they've spent a lot of time worrying about that.
Yeah, that was my next question then. It was, what's up with the RV-15? Is it going to affect us at all? Is it development still going on with that?
It is. They're pushing ahead with it. They recognize that the early airplane, and this is, you got to understand vans. They are thorough to a fault. And I would say there are probably some other kit manufacturers who would take the airplane as it was originally developed and go, "Yeah, it's pretty good," and send it out and send it on its way. Not only is this an unusual configuration for vans, it's our first high-wing airplane. It's in an important category that is competing with some very, very good airplanes. I mean, they're not quite price point equivalent to the Cub Crafters airplanes, but those are really good airplanes. They're really well designed. They've got a lot of engineering behind them. They're incredibly well built. So if you're going to play in that field, you got to get it right. And they know that. And so this has to be a really no excuses airplane. And there is no airplane that you roll off the, out of the computer and into metal that is that good first off. And so they found a few things that they want to make better. There's no thing like, oh my God, how did we do that? It's more like, we got to make that better. And they're also starting to develop in a direction that gives them some more flexibility on engines. They knew that the IO390 Lycoming was a really good place to start. They kind of built around that from a weight and balance perspective, and then said, we really need to build in some more flexibility if people want a lighter, less expensive engine than the 390. And so that is informing the next stage, which will be a new fuselage, basically, that moves the wing and gives them a little bit more flexibility with engine choices without having to carry ballast and stuff like that. You got to understand, vans, they like light airplanes, and the idea of carrying ballast in the airplane, they're going to do everything in their power not to have to do that. So that is developing. We're not going to see it this year at AirVenture, primarily because it's going through a number of changes that they want to try that are just invasive enough that would be hard to make the airplane pretty, and they're not wrong to want to make it presentable, but at this point, the airplane is far more important to them as an engineering tool and to determine the best way to get to a good final product than it is to gussy it up and show it at AirVenture.
I agree. I'm excited. That's going to be a fun one to see come out. Is it only going to be a tail wheel variant? Are they going to do a nose wheel?
They will do a nose wheel. There's all of the engineering done for that. Since they aimed it at the utility market, and the utility market has spoken pretty strongly for a tailwheel configuration, that's what it'll be at first. But they're definitely thinking about that. They've got designs in mind. I'm pretty sure there's structure, maybe not in the prototype, but there will be structure available for a tri-gear airplane. Although knowing vans, they'll probably make it very different. Because if you design, like the Glass Star that I have is designed to be either tail dragger or trike. Because of that, it carries more structure than it needs, and it's heavier than it needs to be, and that's just not Van's way. So I suspect it's going to be one of those where you either get the tail dragger version or you get the trike version, and they're probably not going to be convertible. They may make a liar out of me on that one. I don't know, but I suspect that's how they're going to go.
We'll send them this clip. Well, thanks, Mark. This has been good. And I kind of wanted to get you on because Ryan knows absolutely nothing about the experimental market and is so stuck on heavy iron. So, well, there's some
smaller than a 737.
Yeah, that seems like a safe bet there.
Cool. Well, thanks, Mark. I'm sure we'll have you on as more stuff develops in the KITPLANES world, or if no
worries,
you have anything you want to talk about. Thanks.
All right, Ryan, come on out to Oregon. We'll take you flying. We'll show you some fun experimental stuff and get you hooked. I've been successful getting a few other people who are really skeptical about it into airplanes and go, these are really nice. Yeah, I know.
I'm excited. I might take you up on that.
All right, thanks for joining us on this episode of Inside Aviation. You can find Marc Cook's work on KITPLANES.com. Best way to support him is to become a KITPLANES subscriber. Best way to support us is to sign up for the newsletters to the AvWeb, sign up as a subscriber to Flying Magazine, Plane and Pilot, Aviation Consumer, Aviation Safety, IFR, or KITPLANES. We'll catch you guys next time.